Kurt Cobain's music moved a generation of young people.
His voice and his words spoke to their fears and frustrations, but many of the older generation just don't get it. They don't understand why so many people are so moved by Cobain's sudden death. Como's John Sharifi continues our Team 4 coverage. He heard from people today who have differing views on Kurt Cobain.
Listen to the music. Listen to the words.
Everything is my fault.
These words and the man who sang them moved a generation.
It's a huge loss. It's, I think in a couple years, time will tell, but it could be, this generation's John Lennon.
Is Kurt Cobain another John Lennon?
All you need is love.
To many, there's no comparison. Did you relate to his music?
Not particularly, and I don't think I would, at least in my generation, compare him to John Lennon. Difference in generation.
Difference in generation. Difference in message, too.
Lennon's message of peace, love, hope contrasts with Cobain's message of anger, despair. So you understood the words and the music and all that?
It's kind of hard to understand, but
To many of the older generation, Cobain's music hits a sour note. Some people don't understand why the media has glorified a man who did drugs and ultimately shot himself. Try to explain that to this homeless man.
I mean, man, the man's got it made.
Who panhandles for a living.
I know who he is. He's got Seattle at his feet, got money, he's got everything going, and he does that. And I dug his music. I'm disappointed.
So is 11-year-old Brett Greenbaum, who will miss Cobain and his music.
Yeah. Because in a lot of bands, it's sometimes the whole band that makes the music, and it's sometimes just the singer. And for Nirvana, it's kind of just singer.
Cobain touched a nerve in millions of young people.
And now everybody's awash in this grief and agony. And
tonight, they're feeling pain, while another generation tries to understand.
Maybe there's a generation gap, but
John Sharifi, Como News 4.
And here's what's next in the Cobain story. The medical examiner will perform toxicology tests to see if there were any drugs in Cobain's system at the time of death. The results from that test will be available in about 3 weeks. As for funeral arrangements, they're still up in the air tonight.
Ladies and gentlemen, today I am ashamed to stand in front of you, knowing full well that Nirvana has only been recognized for their contribution in music and not pop culture. This is an atrocity to the music world, fans, and the band itself. It is abundantly clear that Nirvana should be in the Pop Culture Hall of Fame, and it is a dying shame that Nirvana has not already been entered into the Pop Culture Hall of Fame. It is a complete double standard that Nirvana is not in the Pop Culture Hall of Fame, yet Pearl Jam is. A band who rose to music fame through the grunge predecessors Nirvana. So, today, I implore you to introduce Nirvana to the Pop Culture Hall of Fame, and this is why. The founding fathers of grunge, Nirvana, were a Seattle trio which formed in 1990. Kurt Cobain, Chris Novoselic, and Dave Grohl would soon become the men behind a decade-defining album and the genre itself. Nirvana, with their introduction of grunge, kicked off a cultural revolution, with 1991's Nevermind, an album that brought the rock and roll world kicking and screaming into the modern world. The band was not an overnight success. The trio had been on the underground music scene of Seattle for a while. Many of the locals were aware of their eccentric music style and could see there was something special, clawing their way from the underground scene. In agreement with Billboard charts, Nirvana's Nevermind album would sell 30 million copies worldwide and stayed in the charts for nearly 300 weeks, meaning the album went platinum, the highest recognition within the music industry. Ultimately, this highlights the band's large-scale success and the impact they had, not only on their generation, but generations in later years. Evidently, Nirvana have edged their way to the dinner table of many families, even today, so we must notice their impact and give them the respect they deserve. Nirvana's music would lay the foundations for alternative rock, paving way for the weirdos and the misfits. Nirvana's members considered themselves weirdos and introverts, their words, not mine. Despite their fame and international superstardom, they remained humble and true to their values. The people scream for us. Why? What do they see? They are the same people that wanted to kick our asses in high school. Nevermind was an era-defining album, with classic tracks and a timeless appeal that reached well beyond Nirvana's core fanbase to connect with the mainstream. Judges behind the panel. Nirvana's music influenced those who had been through tough times. People who felt like they had nothing now have Nirvana. Nirvana was different, a band for the ages, a band who was approachable and relatable, highlighting their love for the fans and just how significant their impact was. Furthermore, in agreement with music app Spotify, Nirvana, despite breaking up 23 years ago, still has around 3 million weekly listens, highlighting their music didn't only relate to one generation. Instead, their grunge rock music style has impacted a multitude of listeners, and the meaning behind their lyrics is more prominent than ever, even today. It was one of the most influential rock albums of all time, and arguably the last rock album to drastically change the course of popular music. The album and band's most familiar and popular track, Smells Like Teen Spirit, will become an anthem for the youth. Recognized by everyone, the album would give the younger generations a voice, freeing them from the chains that their parents had shackled to them, giving them their own voice, their own opinions, and their own freedom, which entirely corroborates with the band's values and even the definition of the word. Their music was defining and then transcending the genre of grunge. It altered the cultural landscape forever. So, do we not owe it to them? Yes, we. It is impossible to argue that Nirvana's music has not influenced life today. Their influence is seen and recognized universally. A band whose music literally created an entire genre. A band who wasn't pretentious to its fans, but cherished and respected them to the full extent. Cobain appeared as one of his fans in the way he dressed, the songs he wrote, and the things he said. Rather standing out as a figure of aspiration, he was more like a summarized vessel of their thoughts, feelings, despair, and anger. Do you not realize? Nirvana's music reaches across generations and across cultures. The songs Kurt Cobain wrote were so deep and meaningful that they have continued to speak to new generations of people who find meaning in them. Nirvana, without question, set in motion a cultural revolution of the 90s. The classical rock and king of pop, Michael Jackson, had dominated for too long. Nirvana, metaphorically, was a knight in shining armor for music lovers. They brought an unknown and refreshing breath into the music industry, filling it with prosperity and love, which, at this point, the world needed so desperately. Although, 27 years later, the cries from fans and even critics for Nirvana's recognition remain unanswered. 27 years later, a band which literally shaped the music landscape of the 90s, inevitably creating an anthem for a generation, remains unrecognized for their influence. 27 years later, Nirvana, a band who stood for more than just fame, a band who was genuine and stood by its morals, is still overshadowed by critics who claim they were a negative influence and that they represented a negative way of life. If we are not to act, Nirvana, a band whose music inspired so many and influenced society so deeply, will be forgotten about. We owe it to the band and to the lyrical genius that was Kurt Cobain to induct them into the Pop Culture Hall of Fame immediately. I refuse to stand here in front of you any longer. It is evident that Nirvana is deserving of the utmost respect for their achievements throughout their career. Do you not agree? I'm sorry, but if you are too ignorant and unwilling to realize the real impact that Nirvana has had, you are blinded by stupidity and your own selfishness. Even self-proclaimed critics of the band, such as Melody Maker, have realized what the band has achieved for the industry and the world. With Nevermind, the future is assured. Nirvana is the most beautiful, intense, and visceral band on the planet. Apart from this, Nirvana was different, a band as rare as a four-leaf clover, and they must be recognized for what they have done. Part of what was so captivating about Nirvana's music was not so much its stunning originality, but its remarkable fusion of so many different strands of influence. Evidently, it would be an absolute fallacy if Nirvana was not entered into the Pop Culture Hall of Fame. It is integral that Nirvana is honoured for their position in rock and roll and the world. Conclusively, Nirvana's influence on pop culture and society was rivaled by no one other in the 90s. Their music influenced a generation then and still influences generations today. Their impact on the world is unimaginable. They were relatable for so many, a safe haven to escape the day-to-day life. It would be disgraceful and utterly disrespectful to Nirvana and its followers if they were not inducted into the Pop Culture Hall of Fame. My friends and judges of the panel, it is injustice that it has taken 27 years for Nirvana to be recognized for their influence. So, with the power invested in you, I demand that Nirvana is inducted into the Pop Culture Hall of Fame, so they remain as a mark for losers, the misfits, everybody going through the struggle, and most importantly, a mark of a generation.